Okay, here we go. One little glitch. Hopefully that's our only one. And I want to say welcome, everybody. Okay, this is the second in our series, Uncomfortable Conversations. And okay, sorry, just clicking around. And I want to say welcome to our panel and thank you all very much for joining us here, and welcome to everyone sharing with us on Facebook. Hopefully you're all there. We had a little bit of a glitch, but I think we got through it. Someone will tell me on my other little device if we didn't, but we're going to proceed as if, which I think is a philosophical principle, to act as if. Okay, so this is our second uncomfortable conversation, and we're going to uncomfortably speak about economic inequality. And before we engage with this amazing panel that has come together for everyone tonight, I want to frame the conversation a little bit, because economic inequality is a really broad topic, and we are going to canvass a lot of different things under this broad umbrella of economic inequality. So I want to have some flashpoints that I'm going to sort of maybe rev us up a little bit with before we begin. First, we're going to talk about wealth, and I'm going to throw some statistics at us. In 1989, the richest 5% of families had 114 times as much wealth as families in the second quintile, which is one tier above the lowest. So if you're dividing it into that sections, at the median, 2.3 million compared with $20,000. And then by 2016, so we're looking at how much the inequality has grown. So from 1989 to 2016, the top 5% held 248 times as much wealth as at the median. So that's how much the difference is. And we're going to put links to the articles that reference this if you're interested in reading more about it. So that's wealth inequality. What about income inequality? You look at the average chief executive of an S&P 500 company earned 287 times more than the median employee in 2018. So that's just 2 years ago. And then if you talk about racial injustice, so here in Boston, a lot of people are probably familiar with the study that came out, and Aliana, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's 2 years old. Is it from 2018? I think it is. But
it's actually from 2016.
2016.
It's a few years old, yeah.
Okay, that will also be in the comments because I don't want to get any facts wrong. But these aren't things that I'm intimately familiar with. It's just one of those things that's been in the air since then, because the facts are so staggering that the net worth attributed to white households is in and around Boston is $247,000. And the net worth attributed to Black households, African Americans born in the United States, was, they said, a little bit above zero, around $8. And that's in and around Boston. And that's specific to us. Nationally, the numbers are different. There's still a vast inequality, but they're not as unequal as they are here in the Boston area. If you look at housing, in order to afford a modest 2-bedroom apartment in the Boston area at fair market rent, full-time workers need to earn $33 an hour. $33 an hour. And then finally, during COVID, and this is an article we posted on our social media recently, billionaires in the United States, just during COVID, which is the last 7 months, have increased their total net worth by $637 billion. $637 billion, while 40 million Americans have filed for unemployment. So those are just some of the inequalities that exist in our broken system, and some of the things that we'll probably touch upon during this discussion. So again, I want to thank our wonderful panel for coming and for sharing your expertise, your passions, your education, and the work that you do with us. So let me introduce everyone who's here watching with us to our panel. I'm just going to say a quick thing about each of you, and then I'm going to invite you to introduce yourselves. So Aliana is, and I don't know where everyone's lined up for everyone else. That's always a thing that evades me about Zoom. Like, I have the squares lined up a certain way. I don't know how the squares are lined up for everyone else. Yeah, exactly. So I'm going to start the way it is on my little sheet of paper. Aliana is the Impact Director at the Boston Impact Initiative. Dara, I just did it.
That's
Dara,
okay, no problem.
She is a bankruptcy attorney, a bankruptcy and debt relief attorney, and she also sits on the board of the Massachusetts Debt Relief Foundation. Dax is a lead organizer at the Episcopal City Mission. And Peter is a Jesuit priest and the founder and director of A Faith That Does Justice. So thank you guys so much for being here. And now I'm going to invite you just to introduce yourselves, say what you want about your work, and also just tell us why it was you agreed to sit on this panel. What about this issue of economic inequality touches upon what you do and what you care about? So Aliana, I'm going to invite you to go first.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me here tonight, Elizabeth. And I'm glad to be here on this panel, this esteemed panel. I'm Aliana Pinheiro. I'm the Impact Director at Boston Impact Initiative. And we are an organization focused on economic justice. We are a nonprofit investor, if you can imagine such a thing. We make investments into organizations in the Boston area that are either owned by or provide significant opportunity to people of color. And so when the idea of economic injustice, I mean, really is that's what we're working against, right? We're looking to close the racial wealth gap. And so when Elizabeth told me about this panel, I jumped at the opportunity. I'll stop there and save the rest of my spiel for later.
Okay, thank you. Peter, you want to go next?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for inviting me. I'm happy to be here at this panel. I'm Peter Giles. I am a Jesuit priest and I'm a physician who really founded this organization. It's an interfaith organization, a nonprofit, that's called A Faith That Does Justice. Our mission is really to try and raise consciousness about social issues that affect vulnerable people, and at the same time invite others who are perhaps more stable into accompanying people who are having more difficult times. We do this in a number of ways. We have a lot of information that goes out. We hold larger community meetings. We're going to hold one next Wednesday night, October 7th, on faith and the national elections. You know, what is going on? We have a panel full of people from different faith traditions, different racial backgrounds, and should be a very interesting discussion as to what a person of faith really should enter into a process of discerning how do you go to vote for the common good of all. We also reach out to people through a lot of written language. We have an email list that probably has about 3,000 people, and we put out information trying to educate about, I would use the word adult faith, whatever denomination that is, but living it beyond what a child might think, but living, you know, in effect, faith in action, living beyond the church, the temple, the mosque, and into society where there are issues that people need to deal with. And we're trying to help people make that kind of a transition. And then finally, our action component, and the reason probably that most resonates with me being here tonight is that we run an ESOL program, English for Speakers of Other Languages. And not surprisingly, in the city of Boston, at least, there are many, many ESOL programs, and yet the demand has not yet been fulfilled. I mean, there's still many people looking to get in on these types of programs. And we partner with a Jewish Vocational Service, and they run a very high-powered program that really moves people from language skills to job opportunity. And that's what really interested us. We're working, collaborating with them. We run our own program, but we are kind of aligned with them. And there's really, not surprisingly, there's a direct correlation between language skills and salary income. The better you speak, the more likely you are to earn a higher salary. Most of our clients or who take this for free, it is a free program, are recently arrived people, many from Latin America, not exclusively. And we have found that this transition to trying to move them up the scale of language skills to try and move them into better job situations. I'm not telling anyone anything they probably don't know, but obviously people coming without language skills, there's a lot of exploitation that goes on, and we're trying to help at that level. So I'll end for the moment and maybe say a little more later.
Okay, thank you. Dara?
Hi, thank you, Elizabeth, for having me tonight. I'm very, honored to be a part of this esteemed panel as well. And it's a topic that is so necessary to be having right now in the world that we're living in, and with all of the changes that are amongst us. I think that the pandemic is probably the perfect storm to bring it all together, to talk about economic inequality, because you don't generally see this until there's a catastrophic event. Most catastrophic events within families happen with medical issues, within the, crises, maybe family members or loved ones getting cancer, maybe it's job loss, maybe it's divorce, maybe it's an immigration matter. And most of the time, these issues really crop up, and I can see them in my practice. I run a law practice. I'm a sole practitioner here at Sandow Legal, but I also sit on the board of a 501c3 organization called the Massachusetts Debt Relief Organization, which is run by Megan Hurley, who is the director on Commercial Street in Boston. And basically that mission for that organization is to help people overcome their debt with dignity. And a lot of times individuals that are not above the median income do not have access to the legal system properly, if it be debt, if it be housing, if it be any other sort of domestic issue. And also, speaking to Peter's point, English as a second language, or English needing to be a primary language in and around the area. I work in the Lawrence area, which is predominantly Dominican and Puerto Rican, so it's a heavily Spanish-speaking community, but it also has a huge need, an economic need, from both the city itself to the people that have been impacted by the explosions, that have been impacted by the COVID event, now that we're in a high-risk area. But my mission is to help people understand that you can access legal services and not be afraid to reach out to an attorney. In our core mission as attorneys, there is a pro bono element of our work, which we take an oath to provide every single year within our profession. But I find this topic near and dear to my heart because I am a woman who was raised in poverty with a mother who was a single mother raising her children without parental support from the majority of the fathers. I mean, in my household, I'll just say it, there are 4 children. We have 4 different fathers. The child support was always an issue. We lived on government cheese and peanut butter and green food stamps back in the day. So I have seen firsthand how important the inequality of poverty is between not just myself, but then moving into an intercultural or an integrated community where it's actually been expanded upon different communities. And it's interesting because every community handles it so differently. Some communities will stigmatize it. Other communities, try to make it work within, and then other communities are, trying to just rise above it, but have to find the means to do it. So I'm grateful to be part of this panel tonight, speaking about the debt element as well as the housing element. Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you. And Dax.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Dax Crocker, and I am the lead organizer at Episcopal City Mission. Episcopal City Mission is a social justice organization inside the Episcopal Diocese of Massachusetts in downtown Boston. That's where the offices are. We haven't used the offices in March, as many of you also have not. Our mission is to work for racial and economic justice. So this panel is right up our alley. And we work with Episcopalians who want to do social justice in the state of Massachusetts. We work across Western and Eastern Massachusetts, the South Coast, North Shore, etc. And a lot of the work that we do is in conjunction with our grassroots partners who are specialists in what they do, whether it's on driver's licenses for undocumented folks, or healthcare, or public school funding, you name it. And we try to plug Episcopalians with a heart for social justice to connect with the grassroots partners that we have on the ground. I am interested in this panel because housing affordability is a big problem in the Metro Boston area. It's a big problem across Massachusetts, but especially in the metropolis of Boston. And it's interesting that just yesterday in the presidential debate, or whatever we want to call that, what happened yesterday, um, um, one candidate was being accused by the other candidate that if he got elected, the suburbs would be destroyed because people of color would be moved in to the suburbs. Except that a lot of people with money are moving also to the city. And gentrification is happening in the city. People from the suburbs are moving to the city. So where would people with low income families go? If they can't go to the city because they're being pushed out, and they won't be able to go to the suburbs because they don't want them there either, uh, it, where would they go?
Mm.
And the other reason why I'm interested in this, it's because since COVID happened, COVID has revealed that most people with low income, and especially people of color, are the essential workers that maintain the city running, except that they cannot afford to live in the city that they run.
Mm.
So this has become something like the proverbial example of the Ford Motor Company, that eventually the employees of Ford couldn't buy the cars that they made. And so I'm interested in talking about this for those reasons.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you all. I'm so eager to let you guys talk and just ask some questions to let you keep going. I'm just thankful for each of you and the work that you do and the passion that you have for it. So thank you for sharing that. I'm going to start with you, Aliana, and let's talk about systemic inequalities, because you alluded to that, and that's so much of what you do in your work. Let's talk about the inequalities that have led to the issues you address at Boston Impact Initiative. And can you explain a little bit about what you see as causing the inequalities that you address, some of those roots?
Right. Thanks. I'm so inspired by each of you on this panel. So again, happy to be here. In my view, and the view that we take at Boston Impact Initiative, or BII, is that the cause for inequality overall, and also the rate of climate change that we're witnessing, is the way that the system in which we operate extracts value from people and the planet, and essentially considers people and planet disposable. Now, with regards to the racial wealth gap in the US, the inequality that we see today is an issue of systemic racism that goes back to before we were a nation, and our, as it's often said, our original sin of slavery, but has haunted us since then. And some concrete examples that I think people, say, oh, that was so long ago. But some concrete examples in the 20th century of why Black families in particular have had a harder time building wealth, pointing to the statistics that you mentioned earlier, Elizabeth, are the unequal access to the GI Bill benefits after World War II, and the practice of redlining in housing, speaking a little bit about housing, Dara and Dex. So the GI Bill, after World War II, veterans came back and were offered low-cost mortgages, free college tuition, great unemployment benefits. Yet the approximately 1.2 million Black veterans were essentially found it very difficult to access these benefits, or impossible. The South was still very segregated at that time, but so was the North. So it wasn't just a problem of soldiers coming back to Mississippi or Georgia. In the New York area, for example, of the 67,000 GI co-signed mortgages, only 100 went to non-white soldiers. Wow. Just to give an example, right? So the idea of building wealth through owning a home, or building wealth through getting an education, which again, the Black GIs just had a much harder time accessing and getting access to those universities that the white GIs had access to. That wasn't really possible for people returning from World War II. And then a related issue is redlining. So started in the 1930s and continued officially until the 70s, and then elements of the practice exist to this day. But essentially, you know, banks would draw a red line around a neighborhood where they didn't want to lend. These were non-white neighborhoods. And so you just couldn't get a mortgage if you wanted to buy a house. And you couldn't go buy a house in a white neighborhood. And so you couldn't buy a house. You didn't have access to that type of lending. And so when we think about today, what does that have to do with today and what I do? Where do Black entrepreneurs go for funding? Bootstrapping is not something, you know, friends and family capital is not something that they can just, you know, go ask a rich uncle, or, you know, there's no generational wealth that's just trickling down to them. I mean, and there is sometimes, but it's, you know, clearly the level of wealth and the disparity exists, pointing back to Elizabeth's statistic that she mentioned earlier. So our work is really as a gap filler. We are, you know, coming in and providing what we call integrated capital. So we can provide debt, we can provide equity, we even provide small grants in some cases, and we invest in what we call regenerative businesses. So not extractive businesses that we think are causing the problem. We invest in regenerative businesses that are really restoring the productive capacity of communities of color. So that's our investment thesis. That's sort of how we think about what we do. And there's great opportunity. Just in Eastern Massachusetts, we've done over 50 deals since 2013 in our pilot fund and then in our current fund. We've tried all different types of structures, you know, equity, debt, across sectors, but always with this lens of economic justice. And I'll just say it's really important in the investment sphere to kind of bring this sense of justice into investing. Right now, Black founders, or as of 2018, I think, Black founders receive about 1% of VC funding, venture capital funding. And one of the reasons is that the people across the table don't look like them. And there's very few, you know, people of color in the venture capital industry, you know, in finance. And so part of our mission at BII is also about training and promoting fund managers of color, like myself and some of my colleagues. And so we're trying to change the paradigm so that, you know, there's more investors like ourselves that then are funding more deals of these regenerative businesses owned by people of color. And what the final thing I'll say in terms of the work that we're doing that's sort of connected to this is we have what we call the BII funding cohort, fund building cohort. We're working with 11 communities across the country. And the cohort's made up of people of color and women that in each of their own communities, these 11 different communities, are attempting to find a funding solution to close the racial wealth gap. So in New Mexico, it is an Indigenous women-led fund investing in Indigenous businesses. In Seattle, it is a Black-led fund investing in Black tech entrepreneurs, and so on. So there's sort of different iterations of what this looks like across the country, but really trying to take that, you know, take the power and the knowledge and put it into the hands of Black and brown fund managers and women fund managers so that they can go out and make these investment decisions in a better way.
Nice.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just love the way you talk about your work and the passion that you have for it and the ways in which it addresses so many different layers of these things that we're talking about in such creative and innovative ways. It's why I love every time that we talk, and I love being able to just have you speak to different communities and just be a listener in on that. So thank you so much for that. And before I get to asking more questions, I forgot to just throw out there, if anyone has questions that they want to throw into the comment section, please do that. We will hopefully have time for that at the end, where if anything that we're talking about now or anything we're not bringing up, you want to ask the panelists, please feel free to put questions up in there. Thank you. Okay, so I want to move on. Dara, I want to ask you, when we spoke in preparation for the panel, we talked about, and you mentioned as something you're really passionate about, is financial literacy and access, which you mentioned in your sort of introductory remarks. I just want to kind of invite you to talk a little bit more about that and how you see that as one of the biggest barriers and how it touches on some of the different issues that we've referenced so far in our discussion.
Absolutely. So I am the product of financial illiteracy. I am my own best success story, if you will, only because having been raised in poverty, I never was taught what about credit. I was never taught about debt. I was never taught about budgeting money. I was just living in a household where I knew that if the electric went off, that we would have to, use the grill outside to melt water in the winter. And I'm originally from Minnesota, so those are some very, very cold winters, melting water. But I was never taught at a very young age about the time value of money, what it was, how to use it. I didn't know what a credit card was from a debit card. And I got into some serious financial issues as soon as I turned 18 and became an adult and had to live on my own. I learned very, very quickly how to get into debt quickly. And I also learned very quickly how that impacts everything from getting a job to securing financing to going to college. Nobody had taught me how to apply for student loans. Nobody even taught me at the time what a student loan was, how it would be repaid. And I say financial literacy because I think that our student loan debt today is the result of the government's poor planning on this part, because the government basically gave out all of this money without underwriting it. So it gave money to people that might not have ever had an income, might not even know what financial budgeting is. They don't understand the aspects of education from a literacy perspective. And I'm seeing that in practice even now today, as a bankruptcy attorney and working with the Massachusetts Debt Relief Foundation, working with people that are not above the median income, where they can actually, make a sustainable income. But when they come into our offices and we meet with them, we try to give them and restore the dignity that they otherwise would feel stigmatized by. They're embarrassed. They are embarrassed that they found themselves with, a $500 electric bill, or maybe a $1,000 credit card bill, or maybe a medical bill that they've run into. And a lot of times when we ask them what their budget is, they often say that they don't have one. Or they'll often say, I don't really understand how my credit card works. And it goes back to fundamentals of basic learnings. When I went to school, I happened to be from the Midwest. There was no classes, if you will, on how to balance a checkbook, for example, how to make a deposit into an account, how to save for retirement. And what I'm discovering with people today is that when they come in and they're so debt laden and we can help them, file for bankruptcy, we try to destigmatize it, and we try to explain to them that it's not the stigma that you think it is. Yes, you will be able to buy a house again. Yes, you will be able to get into a credit card, a car loan. You'll be able to get into a job. But we want them to just understand, though, how they got there when they arrive in our offices, because once you do bankruptcy, we never want you to have to do it again. And once we can help them actually move along that process, it's rewarding to really educate them. And when it comes to housing, especially, and this moratorium, and Dax, I'm sure you're going to agree with this, we're going to be seeing people with $10,000 to $15,000 to $20,000 worth of debt within the next 2 to 3 weeks once this moratorium lifts. And I can assure you that the average household is not going to be able to repay that, regardless if the landlords are forgiving this debt. It's going to be debt that they're going to have to discharge somehow. And their only mechanism to really truly do that is to go through bankruptcy. And there's going to be a huge need for financial literacy, financial education, faith-based organizations stepping in to do the work of community-based educating and community-based reteaching financial literacy skills. And I just find that it's so fundamental that if I had had this when I was a kid, I don't think that I would have made the mistakes that I had made as a young adult. But I do find that to be really, really critical.
Yeah. So I hear you. So I hear you kind of balancing the individual with some of the systemic things that we're kind of talking about as well. So I want to follow up on two things. One, you started referencing the housing, which I think we'll talk about with some other panelists too. But I know you and I did talk about one of the things that you see as an attorney is this access issue. So I just want you to briefly touch on that issue of access that you see with tenants, and that problem of not having access. And you compared it when we were speaking about criminal attorneys and tenants not having that. So just, will you kind of expound on that a little bit?
Absolutely. So God bless his soul, Justice Gant, who just passed, before he passed, he was worried about the potential 80,000 Massachusetts tenants that could possibly be evicted after this moratorium lifts. And when it comes to this issue, and the reason why it's such an issue is 79% of all landlords in landlord-tenant matters are represented. 8% of all tenants are represented. That's a huge disparity. And a lot of it comes, and it's also a legal access issue to justice, and it's a social issue. A lot of tenants who need counsel for their housing matters cannot get it in this day and age. And we afford criminals the right to a defense, as a protection of their due process rights, because we're taking away a liberty, right? We have the potential to, basically put them into jail, take away their freedoms, strip them of their rights, voting rights, whatever. These are like inherent rights of your liberty. But there's also an inherent right of, safety, if you will, underneath our 10th Amendment, underneath the state's 10th Amendment right, which is what we're seeing by way of the moratorium as it stands right now. The reason we don't have mass evictions right now is you have the state exercising its 10th Amendment right to protect the health and safety of the tenants and to keep them also from spreading potentially, the virus around. But when it comes down to it, there's also that fundamental right, if you will, of liberty from your housing, even though it's not an inherent right, but it is a right that we all take very seriously. And when you can see the disparity of access to legal justice. So for example, the tenants that I represent, the majority of them have landlords that are not abiding by the law, right? Or there's housing issues, or there's habitability issues, or there's discriminatory issues. There's a program put on by the state of Massachusetts called the RAFT program. It's a fund that I believe now has close to $60 million available for tenants in the Commonwealth to access to help them with arrearages caused by the pandemic, but also with other housing needs should they find that they need to move to a new place as a result. But we have more access to criminal records we have more access to housing records in the Commonwealth than we do the actual criminal records. Every single landlord in the Commonwealth, before they rent to you, can go to a database, plug in your name, and if it pops up that you're on this list, it's almost instantaneously going to prevent the landlord from renting to you, because they're going to deem you as being a troubled tenant or a tenant that potentially has a housing issue, if it be a security deposit hold, or maybe it's a late rent, type of hold, or maybe it's the property wants to be sold, a legitimate reason, right, that you can see it. But that housing database is in itself discriminatory for the bulk of tenants as well, because you can land on there through something that is a mistake. You could land on there through something that ends up getting mediated and there's like no finding, or the case gets dismissed, but yet you're still black marked on this particular database. And right now the Massachusetts Congress has going through it a bill that would allow those records to be expunged after 3 years, which is what I think is actually a good step towards equality of justice in the housing space, because it will actually allow that tenant the opportunity potentially to secure more housing again. But as I stated in the initial conversation, after the moratorium lifts, the average household, if the average household, as you mentioned earlier, is $33 an hour, but let's just take $1,500 a month. In 6 months, these people are already at $9,000 in potential arrearages. And again, there's going to have to be a way to assist them. And, speaking also from the landlord's side, because they themselves as well are impacted by this, they're the other side of the economic cycle. They have to have the tenant, and not every tenant is going to be, completely ideal, but you know, they're receiving monies from the government, right? I mean, they're receiving grants from, you know, HUD, they're getting monies from Section 8, they're getting monies from, you know, governmental programs, you know, to house, you know, tenants. There needs to be, if they have the power to take governmental funding, then there should be a due process protection for the tenant on the other side of that money. Because right now it's extremely unbalanced. Landlords get governmental money and tenants don't have the right or access to legal services to defend against those monies that are also given to the landlord, should there be an issue, which there's generally an issue when the cases end up in court. So I'm seeing that in my practice, a lot of tenant issues, and then also a lot of discriminatory issues. People that have, you know, Section 8 vouchers, they want to know how old the children are because the houses are leaded, right? I mean, these are all issues that we need to work through on a community basis, but also we need to try to level the playing field between the landlords and the tenants.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, you're definitely touching on a lot of different things from the housing side. And Dax, I know that that touches on a lot of the work you do at ECM. And do you want to talk a little bit about that work you do, whether it touching on housing and some of the other communities that you work with?
Sure. I was just doing the numbers to start my time here on the data that you gave us in the beginning, that in order for someone to be able to afford housing in Boston, they have to earn $33 an hour. Was that right? Did I hear that right?
Yeah, that was the 2018 data, I believe.
Okay, so that's even 2 years old. That means that that person has to make almost $70,000 a year just so that they can afford to live, not luxuriously,
Right.
but in, you know, some type of housing in Boston. $70,000 a year is not the minimum or the average salary in the Boston area. And so I guess where I would start is by saying that at Episcopal City Mission, we started a mutual aid network in March when COVID hit, and we started receiving news that Episcopalians in different areas were being hit pretty hard with unemployment, obviously with healthcare issues, and the mutual aid network started providing assistance. And it was very curious to me that what we thought would happen was that people were going to be asking for someone to go pick up groceries for them at the supermarket, or medicine, or take out my trash, or if a phone call because I'm isolated because of COVID and I don't have anyone to talk to. And we thought that the majority of requests would be those type of requests. Surprisingly to us, most of the requests were, I am about to lose my housing. I am about to lose the roof over my head. I am 2 months behind in rent. I am 3 months behind in rent. I am 4 months behind in rent. I haven't paid my electricity in the last 5-6 months. People from across the Episcopal Church started donating and meeting some of those needs, and the needs continue to come. And so I started digging a little bit to find out who these people were that were in need of rent assistance and utility assistance. And by far, most of them are service workers, people who are essential workers to our society. They are the janitors, they are the supermarket employees, they are the hospital workers who are getting infected with COVID, but they are running the hospitals or making the hospitals being able to open doors every morning, the trash collectors. And so these are essential workers, and most of them people of color who their hours were cut. And I found quite a few people who said, I am still working, but I'm not working as much. I even found someone who said, I was able to make ends meet because I had overtime before COVID. And so I'm thinking, wow, uh, 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 hearing about the number of $33 an hour that you gave us in the beginning, I'm thinking this woman must have been earning about 20 bucks an hour plus the overtime, and that is how she made uh, ends meet. Now she doesn't have overtime, so she's not making that 33 or so uh, dollars an hour, and she can't pay her mortgage. She's about to lose her home. Um, where do they go? These are people who live in the city or in the right outside the city, somewhere in between the city that is being gentrified and the suburbs, right? So there's like a circle. If you think about Boston in a circle, East Boston, Chelsea, Lynn is the area right before the suburb where people with money live, and right before the city, right? And if you come down the south, Taunton, Fall River, New Bedford are areas where the service workers live, but they're right outside Dartmouth. They're right outside other areas of the Cape or Plymouth, where our people with a little bit more resources live. So these pockets around the city and in between the suburbs are the pockets in which people who make our cities and towns run live and are having a hard time coming up with money to pay the rent, put food on the table, and pay their utilities. Never mind buying a new car, right? That's off the table. Their children don't even think about those things because they have to get around on public transportation. So someone came to me and said, when I was in Virginia, I was part of a network of churches who had the same issue. We were paying rents and we were paying rent and we were paying rents, and it never ended. And the solution was that the churches came together and did a survey about empty properties that the churches owned, that no one was using, and that they were not paying taxes because they're 501c3 organizations. So they rehabbed those properties, they converted them into apartments, and they sold them at a very reasonable price to the people that they were paying rents for, so that the rental assistance need ended and people started owning their own homes at a very low mortgage monthly. That is the same story of another community organization in the Bronx who had the same problem, and they went to City Hall. City Hall gave them for free a piece of land that nobody wanted, and the diocese, the Catholic Diocese of New York, took some of the money that they had in investments and they reinvested it in the form of mortgages, building these properties that I went to see them. One of them is called the Nehemiah Housing Project in the Bronx. And I went to see those properties. Beautiful, cute, small homes where people live in dignity, paying $400 a month in mortgage in New York. So there are ways to solve this problem. It's just a matter of people with will who have the resources to say, I want to do something about it.
Yeah, well, that's great. I like that, thinking creatively and like outside the box, but leveraging the resources that we might have as faith communities. Peter, I want to ask you, in your work through your organization with marginalized communities, have you seen a common thread that hinders income and economic equality or prevents upward mobility?
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to first thank the panel. Listening to you has been, for me, quite informative, and I'm very grateful. You know, we're not in the direct line of service that you people have been doing. Our role has been really to raise consciousness and to try and invite in the the vulnerable into what we're doing. Our meetings that we hold, we do translate for one into Spanish, so that we try to bring people in so that they are part of the discussion and part of the learning process that we're all going through. As far as trying to directly answer what you said, I mentioned earlier on, where do we see the economic opportunity or upward mobility being hindered? I mentioned the idea of language. I mean, our program is really directed at trying to combat that. That's one area. I would say too, another one that we've become very aware of, especially in the past 4 to 5 months, is really the systemic racism in this country. As a person of white privilege, I've always felt that I had been somewhat open to the idea of the plight of people of color. And yet, this past 4 months, seeing the confrontations visually on the news media of African Americans being killed in situations with law enforcement has been quite humbling to me, and I think a lot of other people of goodwill, that to realize that we have been told this for so long and at some level acknowledged it, but now it's at a whole different level. It is very difficult at this point to say that what is going on in this country for 400 years now, there's any justification at all, and that we're in a situation where things do need to change, and they need to change dramatically. Some examples that we see of that, we deal with the Spanish-speaking population to a fair amount in different parts of the city. And perhaps I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but there's an expression that a lot of these people who are undocumented, they wander in the city in fear and in the shadows, that they are constantly vigilant as to who might be around them that could cause them trouble with ICE or whatever, and get themselves deported. We run into a lot of people who are undocumented, and it is an amazing existence of the way these people have to live. It is totally different than someone of white privilege would live. The other thing, I think, from the African American community, this summer has been a real eye-opening experience, as I mentioned, of just visually seeing what has happened. I was on a panel recently where there was a woman, I forget her name and her organization, but she came from Georgia and she lives in Boston now. And she talked about in Georgia, when her family members, he had a brother, when he turned 18 or whatever the age for a driver's license was in Georgia, he said there's actually 2 parts to getting a license in Georgia. And one is you get the license, you get the documentation that says you can drive legally. She said the other one is when you come home and your family sits you down and tells you the etiquette of an African-American male in particular, how he is to act when he gets pulled over to the side of the road by law enforcement, because you could lose your life in the process. And I think this summer has made that very apparent, that that is what goes on. And as a person of white privilege, I have been pulled over to the side of the road, and I never once had the thought that I could be killed. So it really just points out the reality of a life that we have been told about for so long, and that now we need to act. And I think from our perspective, we are trying to raise consciousness about this. And with our national elections coming up, we are holding this conference for this specific reason of trying to get people of faith to realize that this is a crisis moment in the history of this country, and that people need to step up and to act. So I don't know if that maybe it's a little bit of a different answer than some of you have been given, but I think for us, it's relevant. And fortunately, we've had a very good response. We've had a lot of people from, the one advantage to the whole COVID thing is everyone's gone online and we don't have to be local. We have people who have pre-registered for this conference from all over the country. So that is a good thing. It extends the breadth from which we can really try to influence people. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's where I'd say we're at.
Yeah, no, absolutely it does. And thank you. And it actually transitions us into what I'd like to sort of ask as an open question to any of you guys who are willing to answer it. As we've talked about so many things, and you guys have just shared with us, again, your expertise and your knowledge and your work, and I'm so thankful for that. But as we talked about when we were preparing for this, that's all great, but I'd love for us to be able to offer, the people who are with us right now, and as we share this recording with people in the future, what is it that we can do? The how then should we live question, right? So it's sort of a twofold question, and I invite you to answer one or both of the folds. In light of all of these injustices, which we've touched on or gone in depth in some of them, what is it that we can do as people of goodwill, as Peter said, as some of us as people of faith, as people who just want to make the world better, want to change some of these systems, some of these individual problems that we've addressed? Are there other steps that you can encourage people to take? And related to that, how can people connect with the work that you do in a way that might help further the work that you're doing? So we do have, we'll throw up the links. I think they might already be in the comments on Facebook of your different organizations. So those will be there. But if you have other things, and again, feel free to talk about your organizations and the ways people can connect with your work. So I would just invite any of you who want to answer that to answer.
I guess I'll start, and I'll just quickly say, what can we do? I think, Peter, I really appreciate your kind of calling out and acknowledging the privilege that you have, but really that all of us, sitting here have, and probably most people watching this have. And just to say that, it's nice to make a small donation or volunteer a little bit of your time. And I think we need to think more broadly of, if we're thinking about real justice, what is it that we might need to give up? And it might be a little bit uncomfortable for us, right? And so Dax, you mentioned that the church, took part of its investment fund and invested it in this different way. And I think that's a great example of kind of thinking differently. I think this summer, Peter, like you mentioned, we've been confronted, all of us, have been confronted with different levels of our privilege. And just thinking of, what is it that I need to give up, and that like maybe like we as a faith community, or, at my workplace or wherever, in order to make the world a more just place. And, you think about Jeff Bezos and all the money he's made in the pandemic with Amazon, and if he could give some of that up and his workers could make $33 an hour, they could live a better life. So I invite you all to think of, it might be a little uncomfortable, but what can I give up in order to make the world a more just place?
I think too that, I think this is excellent, because I think that so many people hide behind their problems, right? And they're just afraid of the mental health issues or the stigma that's going to attach if you tell somebody you lost your job, or you're suffering financially, or, you need help maybe with food on your table, or you need help with rent, right? Or housing. And I think that companies, corporations, big and small, can actually, and maybe, could actually start the conversation through their human resources departments. I mean, they are in the business of managing people, right? And managing them at every turn of their life, from the time they're hired. Maybe they have a life event with, medical insurance. Maybe there's, a death in the family, and then retirement, right? And we haven't even begun to even address, the booming elderly population that we have that is living on restricted incomes. And they are probably one of the hardest hit during this pandemic as well. They're choosing between medicines and putting housing. And we're talking about, household incomes of maybe $1,200 a month on Social Security, where they're trying to find ways to live. And I'm not saying that the problem is to throw more money at it, but I think that what we can do is to find more community-based programs, reaching out to the community, helping them figure out, are they in the best situation that they can be? Are they living, again, beyond their means, right? Is there a better and more affordable way or affordable place to put them? But again, it comes back to Dax's issue. We are in a housing crisis. I mean, especially in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, we don't have enough housing to go around. And this has always been a problem, even before COVID. has struck. So I do think that we need to just open up the dialogue, and we need human resource departments to be open to talking to professionals like myself or the Massachusetts Debt Relief Organization to come in and actually have, meet and greet moments. Hey, let's talk about things in private. Let's go to council. Let's go to our, our ministries, our priests, our communities of color, our communities of privilege, whatever we are, if it's Black, white, Hispanic, we need to be able to come together to solve the problem. And I think that if we can just remove the stigma and remove, the mental health issues behind it and just start talking about it like we are here tonight. And thank you again for having us. I think that this is going to open dialogue, and I'm hoping to see more of this type of a discussion coming up, within the debates and where the direction of our country is going as well.
Thank you.
I would encourage people following on Aliana's comment that we could start thinking differently about how we use our money. What if we opened a fund to create real estate that is affordable, instead of giving our money to foundations that only do direct service, but don't address the root cause? And so the need will be there next month, right? Which is something that one of our donors in the mutual aid network told us. We're going to pay this rent, and by paying it, we have to accept the fact that that need will be there next month. If they couldn't afford to pay that rent this month, it's because they won't be able to afford it next month either, unless there is a miracle, right? But most people will take 3 to 6 months to stabilize financially, find another job, find another part-time job, or whatever they have to do in order to stabilize financially. And so that need is going to be there next month. And if that moratorium expires and nothing is done, we are going to see waves of people right after the election that are going to be kicked out of their homes and moved somewhere else. I don't know where. And all those houses close to the city, close to the suburbs, will be just taken over by developers. And then the cycle will just continue.
There are talks right now in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to create a legal fund. I think it was by a bunch of nonprofit organizations. They wanted to fund for legal services for tenants. And I think that was a proposition that was made to Governor Baker. I don't know where his position is on it today, but I believe that this is one avenue that it has been and is being explored potentially. And that's a different way of looking at how can you, again, help balance the inequities and the injustices that exist in the housing court at the moment. And that's, Dax, to your point, I mean, it's how do you use money differently? And, it's a fundraising issue, right? Once you start fundraising, you're always fundraising. But for a family in need that can't even make the rent this month, it's becoming a cyclical problem. And until you fix the root, you're always going to have that as an issue.
Yeah, the roots.
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to invite you to.
I would just add to that the idea that what we're trying to do is also ask people to listen to the stories of the people who are suffering, be it racism, be it housing, be it the immigration people who are really suffering, to listen to the stories and to allow them to move you. And I think, as Aliana said too, then, the idea of what do we give up? Maybe another way of saying that too is, can you risk becoming uncomfortable? Can you become a little uncomfortable? Because that is where growth will come. That if we're willing to be uncomfortable and to risk some of our security, some of our privilege, and reach out and walk in solidarity with people who are suffering, that is where I think there's a gateway into something bigger for goodness for the common good of all people. So that's one thing we're pushing. And then I think the idea of collaboration, a lot of us, you're not going to change the world by yourself, but if there are people out there doing things already that you can plug into some of the work that you people are doing, to volunteer, to get involved with some of these organizations that are directly involved with the issues that people are suffering from, It is a way to act. I always talk about this idea that, that true faith really has a heart, hands, and legs. It isn't just a mind. It is something that moves into society. And I think we have to keep that in mind, that if we really want to live faith, it is a lot more than going to the church, the temple, or the mosque. It's about living in society, in the midst of people who are suffering. So I'd end with that. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, this has been such a wonderful conversation, and I'm so thankful, not just for the time you gave tonight, which I'm very thankful for, but for the work you guys do. And I just want to lift up some of these last comments that you guys shared, because I just think it's so helpful as we close to think about what you're encouraging us to do, thinking about what I can give up, dialogue, removing stigmas, thinking about how we can use our money differently, addressing root causes, risking becoming uncomfortable, collaboration, and listening to the stories of those who are suffering. I just think if we could do one of those things, we would make a big difference. We would shift our own personal direction, our own personal lens in such a way that we would be oriented differently. And I'm just thankful for you guys for just guiding us tonight. So thank you to everyone who's been with us. And again, this is something that we will be sharing with our network. And I'm so glad that we had this conversation, and good night.
Elizabeth, before we go, can I just mention that next Wednesday, if you're interested, we invite the world to come into this discussion we're going to have on faith and the elections. What are we up to here and what's going on? Elizabeth would have contact information if you're interested to register. It's free. We'd love to have you be present. So thank you.
Yes. Thank you for calling attention to that, Peter. We did put it in the comments, but you're right. I did want to specifically call attention to that because it's a great next step to enter into that conversation. I think it's obviously incredibly timely, and their organization always does these kinds of talks really, really well. I've attended a number of them, so you'll not be sorry to go. So yeah, the link will be in the comments, so you can just click on that to register for that free event. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Nice to meet all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Have a great night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.